Time now for our daily focus report. The United Nations has named November the 2nd as the International Day to End Impunity for Crimes Against Journalists. Over the past decade, more than 900 journalists have been killed, but 90% of those cases have gone unpunished. One such example is in Malta. The country's leading investigative journalist, described as a one-woman WikiLeaks, was murdered in a car bombing. Her son accused senior politicians of being complicit in the killing.
This is Bidnia, a small village on Malta Island, and once home to independent journalist Daphne Caruana Galizia.
Her standard nickname, insult, that her detractors used to use was Sahara al-Bidniya, the witch of Bidniya. The classical medieval attitude that when men cannot explain a woman, they call her a witch.
On October the 16th, while she was leaving her house, Daphne Caruana Galizia was killed as a bomb underneath her car exploded.
So the explosion through the car, try to imagine something like 80 meters away from where it was. It is earth-shaking. I remember when I got the news, a few minutes after it happened, a friend of mine called me and he said, I think they got Daphne. But I think though everyone was shocked when she died, no one was surprised.
A freelance journalist and a blogger, Daphne had increasingly caught the ire of those she wrote about in recent years. The Panama Papers, corruption scandals, oil smuggling. There was nothing she didn't handle, and she made quite the name for herself in Malta, and more than a few enemies. But the violent nature of Daphne Caruana Galizia's death sent shockwaves across the island, where tributes poured in and protests multiplied. A single question abounded: how could this have been possible? Those asking loudest are the journalist's friends. One of them, Petra, had followed Daphne's articles for some time and carefully keeps each magazine where she figured. She knew her friend was taking risks.
She had many threats, constantly threats. She had also, a few times, she had an arson attack on her house, where they had put burning tires and tried to burn down the door and tried to burn down the house. She was used to that. She always got threats. She put them up also on her blog sometimes and mentioned them. She got them by email, she got them by letter, so this was the kind of life she was leading.
Even so, the blogger had no government protection. Working alone was a network of anonymous sources. 2 weeks after the blast, her murder was still the top headline in the Times of Malta, one of the island's major papers. In its newsroom, shock was giving way to a far more unpleasant feeling.
All the journalists' families were concerned at what happened. Yes, I mean it's worrying because, as I said, we've never had this situation before.
The paper asked its readers their opinion. 88% of them don't expect Daphne Caruana Galizia's murder will ever be solved.
There have been now 6 car bombs in 18 months, none of which have been resolved. And this is in a small country like this, which is actually meant to be one of the safest in Europe. So there is clearly here a problem of people acting with impunity. And this is what worries me and what worries my colleagues, that the institutions have been allowed to operate in such a way that the police, there is not much trust in them.
Malta's far more used to attention from tourist brochures than from the international press. 450,000 residents, a burgeoning economy, tourism on the rise. But the Mediterranean island is also proving a haven for mafia activity. Its political opposition accuses the government of allowing corruption and criminality to flourish unchecked.
God forbid the Prime Minister did it himself or commissioned it himself. God forbid. But he is certainly politically responsible. It comes after a series of events that took place, such as the dismantling of public institutions that are no longer effective, from the police commissioner to the attorney general in this country, such as one corruption scandal after another, culminating in Panama Papers that involved people in the highest positions of power.
Such accusations have made it all the way to the European Parliament. Malta's government is under pressure.
I completely refute any outrageous claims such as this country does not uphold rule of law. I really think that such claims are exaggerated. I shudder to think that journalists don't feel safe, and I think the opposite is true. People in general and journalists do feel safe to work in Malta.
That's an opinion that's not shared by these women who've come to protest outside the Prime Minister's office, marching for press freedom. They want the resignations of both the general prosecutor and the chief of police.
They refuse to listen to the people, so we're going to camp here in front of our office until they do listen.
There's a problem with institutions in Malta. If the government has something to hide, maybe they don't. But we will never know because they have both the police and the justice system in their pocket. That's the problem. And that's why we'd like to have a real separation of powers. The three powers, independent and separated.
That's very important.
On their T-shirts, words from Daphne's final blog post, published just a half hour before her death. And that's precisely the battle Manuel Delia wants to fight. For him, Daphne was a mentor and an example to follow.
A few weeks ago, I wrote, the problem with Daphne Caruana Galizia is that there's only one of her. And now there isn't one of her anymore. But I do think that we all have a responsibility to continue her work. So yes, I do feel that burden. I do feel the responsibility of living up to her very high standards. And I know I'm going to fall short, but I'm going to do my best.
Since Daphne's death, her blog's audience has increased tenfold, with more attention than ever being paid to the issues she wrote about. Meanwhile, Manuel Delia tells us fear won't keep him from writing. It'll push him to write even more.
Well, for more, let's speak to Larry Kilman, author of the UNESCO report, An Attack on One is an Attack on All. Thank you for coming into France 24 today. In the case of Daphne Caruana Galizia, the Maltese government continues to refuse accusations that suggest it's negligence in her killing. What do you make of that?
Well, in general, okay, I'm not an expert on Malta, but in general, the state and the authorities have the responsibility of creating an environment where journalists can work in safety. So clearly, when a journalist is killed, more can be done. The system failed when that happens. All they can do for her now is to ensure that the crime is aggressively investigated and prosecuted, and we'll have to wait and see what happens for that. But clearly more can be done, and it's really not helpful to deny a problem exists.
Yeah, some of these crimes that we saw in the report, people wouldn't think they happen in Europe. We were hearing that there were 6 car bombs in the past 18 months, none of which have been resolved. This is a thing that sometimes people think might be a problem in some far-off land that they don't know about. But in your research, have you seen that this is systemic to more one location than another, or is this a problem that the whole world's trying to deal with?
Well, you know, the places where the most journalists are killed are the obvious one. Afghanistan leads the list, for example. But it's not limited to those, you know, to war zones. People who cover crime, for example, or corruption, put themselves in danger, and this is a problem everywhere. It's not limited. It's geographically diverse. It happens everywhere. But your point about people not paying attention is a really important one, because that's the basic part of the problem. Journalists have a role in society that's crucial to democratic society, and more that role is being ignored or not understood. And really, I mean, today is the day against impunity, but every day should be the day against impunity for that reason.
All right, and that day against the impunity, precisely named because we at France 24, we lost 2 of our colleagues at our sister station, RFI, Claude Verlon and Ghislain Dupont, killed in Mali 4 years ago. That case really becoming symbolic of journalists' plight.
Yes. Anybody who works in journalism is touched by it, absolutely. You know, people your colleagues and friends who are killed, who are courageous, who continue reporting, even in the face of threats. This is what journalists do. But as your report said, more than 900 journalists have been killed in the last decade. And very few of them get prosecuted, let alone lead to a conviction and punishment. 10% are resolved out of those. So yes, it's a worldwide problem.
Your report, an attack on one is an attack on all. What were some of the highlights from this report? What are concrete measures that can be put in place to protect journalists?
Well, the report it's a bit unusual for an intergovernmental report in that it's not a comprehensive look at the problem. It's basically a collection of stories about what journalists themselves are doing and how they're reacting to the dangers that they face. And they're very personal stories and very human stories. They're basically, many of them were started, these initiatives, by people who lost friends and colleagues. So it ranges from everything to providing medical training, to providing training on how to protect yourself in dangerous environments, digital security training, trauma training. There's a recognition now that trauma is a problem. To networks now, where the guides are being produced about best practices, what journalists should do when they're in the field, what the responsibilities of the media companies they work for. And it even goes into journalists investigating the murder of their colleagues where prosecution has not occurred. That's happening in a number of countries now.
All right. Thank you. Larry
Thank
Kilman,
you.
author of the UNESCO report, An Attack on One is an Attack on All. That's it for now. Please stay tuned. More headlines coming up in just a moment.